Linda and welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about growth. And the reason why I wanted to talk about growth is because I recently realized that we all seem to have, or at least most of us seem to have, this idea that the trajectory of growth is always upwards and forwards. For some reason, I'm not sure when this originated or where or by whom, but most of us have this concept that when you're learning something or you're growing, that the trajectory of that is always continues to get better and easier. And the truth of the matter is that in my personal life, that has never been the case, nor has it been the case in the lives of most people that are around me. So I was recently, a few weeks ago, went out to dinner with a friend of mine, and we were talking about this, and she was talking about how frustrated she was with the fact that, she was trying to develop develop some skills in her, in a particular area in her life, and that she felt like she was a little stalled, right? Like she was making no progress, and she was becoming really frustrated with that. And as we were talking, I started relating to her a similar situation that I had a few months ago, where I was in a place where I was repeating a pattern in my life that I thought I had already conquered or I had already grown out of. And I was saying to one of my closest friends, but I've done this already. Like, I already learned this lesson. Why is this showing up in my life again? And what I find is that is because our expectation is that growth is, like I said at the beginning, an upward and forward linear trajectory. And through my own process, what I found is that there's two categories. There's really three categories for growth. One of them is, the linear upward and forward. But there are two categories that we're talking about when we talk about our frustration with our lack of growth, if you will. And one of those categories, and the first category, is when we feel like we're going backwards. And the example that I just gave about myself a few minutes ago is actually an example of that, where you've had a learning or a lesson or growth in your life. In my case, it was within my own spiritual journey and my own self-development journey. I had worked very hard to dismantle some of the patterns that I had in my behavior that I thought were unhealthy, and here they were, a few months later, showing up again. And what that is, so that's one of the categories that I feel people get really frustrated with in their growth, in their own journeys. And I categorize that as the idea of taking a step backwards, right? And what I found is, and I knew this already, but when you're frustrated with your progress, you tend to forget those things. But what I remembered was that a lot of those times when we are growing or learning, but particularly when it comes to self-development or spiritual journey, we get to a point where we feel that we're going backwards because we're either repeating old patterns or having to address similar patterns or similar situations where we've experienced in the past and that we believe we've outgrown. And it may feel to us sometimes like we are taking a step back. And I want to sort of reframe that, not just for all of you watching, but also for myself, in that I believe that is actually an important, very important step in our growth journey. Because I don't believe that that's necessarily taking a step back. I believe that when those situations present themselves in our lives, what it is that either there is more for us to learn there, meaning sometimes you have a similar overall pattern, but the flavor of it is a little different. Like, for example, one of the things that happens to me a lot is that I would have a pattern in my life when it comes to men and romantic relationships, and I work with it and I dismantle it or heal it and move forward. And then what I find is that maybe a few months later or a few years later, that pattern shows up again, but it shows up in my friendships with males or females. So it's the same underlying theme, but the way it manifests is a little different. So it requires some fine tuning of the skills that I developed to navigate that. So that's one of the reasons where that may happen. And the other reason why I found in my, like I said, in my life and the life of the people around me, where those things happen, where you re-encounter a pattern that you believe you've already healed or outgrown, is to reinforce the lesson. And that's actually also a very, very important thing. And I want to equate it or use the analogy of, like, for example, when you're learning, to cover this area for both of those examples that I gave, I just want to use the analogy of, like, for example, when you're learning to read, right? When you're a little kid and you're learning to read, you first learn the letters, and then you start learning words and then stringing sentences together, etc. But you don't keep reading the same book over and over and over for the rest of your life, right? You start with a little book that is, I don't know, just a child's book, and then you move on to something a little bit more complex, and eventually you're reading novels and all of that stuff, right? So it's all letters, it's all words, but there's different flavors of them. Some are more advanced than others, some are different themes, and what that does is it allows you to continue to reinforce that learning in your brain to the point that it becomes second nature and completely automatic. And that's how I view, most of the time, these scenarios where these patterns come back up, is for me to either, because I really need to learn a different flavor or some nuance, there's some nuance to it that I need to learn, or to get more skilled at, and or to reinforce the learning that I already have. So that's one of the parts of growth that people can often get more very frustrated with, because they feel like they're taking a step backwards, but it isn't in fact taking a step backwards. It's basically mostly reinforcing that lesson and really, really learning that skill to navigate that relationships, or to learn to speak another language, or whatever the case may be. The other thing that I find that people, and again myself too, get really frustrated is with periods of time in our growth where it feels like we are stalled or like we're halted, right? Like we are completely stagnant. A lot of times we are growing a lot for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it seems like all of the growth and all of the learning has stopped. And it can become really frustrating, because you feel like, oh, I've learned everything, or I've learned almost everything there is to know, and now there's just nothing for me to do, and that's something that happens particularly when we're talking about like what we talk about this channel, which is your spiritual journey and your self-development journey. That can be really frustrating, because sometimes it can feel like stagnation. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I think it's very, very important for us to also reframe that category. And it's the reframe is that those are times where your mind and your soul, your spirit, needs a little bit of a resting period, right? Especially if you've had a lot of growth really fast. In a short period of time. Your mind, your spirit, your soul needs some time just to rest, and not only just take all of that in, but also integrate it into your being, so that again, it becomes more second nature to you. So those are the things that I wanted to cover today when it comes to growth. This idea that growth is linear, it really, I just think it's just a myth. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I really have never met anybody who's had that experience. And it is really important for us to reframe this conversation, because a lot of times this just causes a lot of frustration for us, and sometimes to the point where we just want to say, oh, I'm sick of this, I don't want to do this self-development journey anymore, or this, the spiritual journey anymore, it's just too hard and I keep going backwards. And I think it's important that we have a little bit of compassion for ourselves and a little bit of understanding of what the human process of growth is, so that we can really, really help ourselves to grow in a way that is more integrated and more fulfilling for us. So with that, if I would love to hear in the comments, what experiences have you guys had with your own frustrations, with your own growth, with your own self-development in any area? You know, it could be professional, educational, but especially when it comes to your spiritual journey or your own self-development journey. I would love to hear about that. So if you want to put it down in the comments. And with that, I will talk to you again soon. Thank you for listening. And as always, namaste.